with the State of California Executive Order N-29-20 dated March 17th, 2020. All members of the subcommittee are participating in this meeting by video conference with no physical meeting location. Members of the public wishing to observe the meeting live may do so on YouTube at mountainview.gov/YouTube. As noted in the meeting agenda, members of the public may provide oral public comments online during the public comment period for an item by signing up at mountainview.gov/CSREI_speakers or by phone by dialing 669-900-9128 and entering webinar ID 944-9630-3341. This meeting is scheduled to end at, I believe, 5:30 p.m. and we have a large number of attendees. In order to ensure that we're able to hear from all speakers and progress through this meeting, speakers will be allowed up to 90 seconds to speak. Any emails received by 2 p.m. today were forwarded to the subcommittee. Emails received after 2 p.m. will not be read during the meeting, but will be entered into the record for the meeting. All votes taken will be by roll call vote. This time, I will take roll call for attendance. Mayor Abekoga.
Here.
Vice Mayor Kamei.
Here.
Councilmember Ramirez.
Here.
This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wishing to address the subcommittee on any matter not on the agenda. Speakers are allowed to speak on any topic for up to 90 seconds during this section. State law prohibits the subcommittee from acting on non-agendized items. Would any member of the public on the line like to provide comment on an item that is not on the agenda? If so, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. So any members in the attendee box, if you want to speak on any item not on the agenda, you may raise your hand at this time. It looks like there's some people still joining, so I'll just give it a few seconds. Seeing none, I will go ahead and move to section 4.1. The selection of the subcommittee chair. And this subcommittee should select a chair to lead and facilitate subcommittee meetings. Subcommittee members should nominate and vote for a chair. Do any subcommittee members have questions? Okay, seeing none. Would any member of the public on the line like to provide comment on this item? If so, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Okay, seeing none, we will move to the subcommittee deliberation and action. Subcommittee members, please nominate and vote to appoint a chair of the subcommittee. I'll entertain a motion. Mayor Abekoga.
Thank you. And I just want to also thank everyone and staff for helping us put together this first meeting of the subcommittee. As we've talked about this over a couple of council meetings, I'm excited that we are underway and getting this process together. And I'm pleased to have our 3 members on this committee. I look forward to the work that we are expecting to do. And just to put into context what my hope is with this committee is that we look at the issue of race and inclusion and diversity as a whole. I know we've received quite a few comments on various aspects in light of the events that have gone on in this country, but my hope really is to look at these issues in terms of our city's operations as a community, in regards to race relations, and building a stronger community as a result. So I look forward to the work that we are looking to do. And with that, I I would actually like to nominate our Vice Mayor, Ellen Kamei, to chair this subcommittee.
Second.
Great. There's been a motion and a second to nominate Vice Mayor Kamei as the subcommittee chair. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Great, thank you. Vice Mayor Kamei, I'd like to turn it over to you to chair this committee meeting now.
Great. Thank you, City Manager McCarthy. So I believe this ends item 4.1, so we can move on to item 4.2, correct? Great. Okay, so we'll move on to item 4.2, which is an update and discussion related to the city's commitment to engage the community in meaningful dialogue and take action toward a vision of racial justice and equity in Mountain View and renewed public interest in law enforcement. I think we'll begin with a staff report. Is that correct? Staff update. Great. I'll turn it over to you, City Manager McCarthy.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Kamei. Besides myself, I'd first like to introduce our staff that are assisting with the efforts towards this subcommittee and moving forward. So first, Audrey Seymour Ramberg is the city's Assistant City Manager, and she serves as the staff liaison to the Human Relations Commission. And so she will help bridge the HRC's work on race, equity, and inclusion and work with this subcommittee as well. And Melvin Gaines is the city's principal management analyst. He leads the city council's major goals process, and he'll also be helping to lead efforts on our strategic planning process. And the creation of this subcommittee was intended to demonstrate the city's commitment to engaging with our community, as the mayor said, about race, inclusion, diversity, and systemic inequalities. Also discuss what policing may look like in the future in Mountain View, and provide direction to staff on developing recommendations for the full council's consideration this fall. And before we start that, I want to acknowledge the significant amount of time that members of our community have spent in providing their ideas and comments and feedback on this matter. And we know this is an issue of great importance, and we have said that in the last couple council meetings. And I think it also bears repeating in this forum that we are committed to reevaluating and reimagining our city operations and policing to ensure that it is equitable and just. And this isn't going to happen overnight. It will take time, and we really want to make sure that we get this right for our community. And this subcommittee meeting is a first step in that process. So in that vein, today's meeting topics include receiving an update from Police Chief Max Basel on the police department's use of force policies and the significant changes that have been made. Also brainstorming about opportunities to create two-way dialogue and other community activities and events towards this effort. And that also includes working with the Human Relations Commission. And finally, providing direction to staff on next steps. So following Chief Basel's presentation, we will open for public comment on the business agenda item. So that would include the police chief's presentation and community conversations and potential events and activities that the subcommittee may consider, and also next steps that this subcommittee may take. So I'd now like to turn it over to Chief Max Basel for a presentation and update.
Thank you, City Manager. I'm going to share my screen. Are you able to see it? Hello?
Yes,
Looks good.
We can see that.
Okay. Thank you, council members. This is the police department's presentation to the subcommittee on race, equity, and inclusion on our use of force and de-escalation policy. And today I've been asked, in addition to sharing the policy, to provide just an overview of our calls for service to give some context I'll update you briefly on kind of the architecture of policies and procedures and the purpose, and then finally discuss our updates to use of force and de-escalation. We've changed the name of our policy to reflect de-escalation. So in terms of our calls for service, we have two general categories, dispatched and self-initiated. And within the categories of calls for service, I'll talk a little bit about our caretaking responsibilities, investigation, and enforcement responsibilities. And while the majority of calls are handled by sworn officers, we do have non-sworn staff, community services officers, as well as police assistants that handle a number of the non-urgent calls that are more cold reports or complaints around quality of life or parking, as an example. These numbers are rounded from 2019. They're not specifically accurate. They have the general rounding of what our calls for service, which is CFS, and the bottom line, darker blue bar depicts our dispatched calls for service at about 18,000, a little over, and 17,000 are self-initiated, also a little bit over. So it's more in line of 36,000 calls that are handled annually. Of those, we generate about 9,100 cases in 2019. About 5,400 of those cases, and when I say cases, those are police reports that are written by the staff, either CSOs, community services officers, or police officers, detectives that take a case. And they could just be informational cases, or they could be crime cases for follow-up, or processed through the district attorney's office for complaint. And of those 9,100, about 5,400 are crime reports of some sort. Traffic collisions are another about just under 500 cases that we take, which is a high number. And then we have a number of service cases that are also generated as a part of that, non-criminal cases that we document. In terms of traffic stops, we do roughly about 7,300 traffic stops a year, about 20 per day. About 3,100 of those are result in citation, and a number may result in arrest, for example, DUIs, and others are just perhaps warnings that are given to the violator. And we make about 2,000 arrests per year. So the general categories that we define as a perspective of what we do and our responsibilities, the caretaking, investigative, and enforcement aspects of policing. So as an example, traffic stops have an enforcement component to it, but this last weekend, as an example, an officer stops a vehicle, determines the driver is under the influence, so it brings an investigative component. As a part of that, they find a loaded handgun in the vehicle and make the arrest for the DUI and the enforcement, as well as the loaded handgun. So there's a community caretaking perspective as well. Another example, more community caretaking, but having some investigative overlap, are missing person cases. And we get called to all age groups who could be missing for a variety of reasons. Either they choose to go, or they're at risk and the family's not aware of why. And we help determine where the location of that person is, or at least alert the community if they can help find the individual who's missing. Alarm calls and open door investigations is an example, both investigative and community caretaking, likely not enforcement related. And disturbance calls, where we get called out to everything from loud parties to civil disputes or domestic disputes, in which we may not take enforcement action, but we try to help resolve the situation through a community caretaking perspective. However, those can also lead to investigative and enforcement if, for example, if the disturbance has risen to a point of violence or threatened violence, or in one case last year where we responded on a disturbance seemingly innocuous, in which the person who was involved ended up being the suspect in a serious sexual assault, and officers on scene were able to help make that determination and then take enforcement on an unrelated incident. Quick word on mental health calls, which is really a community caretaking responsibility that we're involved in. We do about 20 calls per month in which we place a person on a psychological hold. And we may not transport them, an ambulance may, depending if there's a medical condition, or we transport them. We also do partner with Uplift Family Services. For example, last week we had a call from a family involving a youth member of the family who was in need of some assistance. So we notified Uplift and facilitated the response of them to provide that intervention. We also have been meeting regularly for the last several years with the county to support the standing up of a mobile response team. It's been beta tested. We do occasionally have their services responding to the city to assist with those calls. However, we still primarily are the services that are first responders to those particular events. And with all the questions around this particular topic, we're certainly open and have been discussing and are very interested in partnering with the county moving forward. Lastly, I'll just say in the community caretaking is, we respond on even calls of persons down, and people often wonder, why are police responding when someone, may have fallen down in a park or on a sidewalk? And a multitude of reasons. We do have first aid defibrillators and as well as Narcan that we're equipped with, but we also have an investigative component to ensure that there's no assault or other incident that led to that, as well as providing intervention if the person's unable to care for themselves, but they're not a medical patient. We'll facilitate transport to the sobering station, as an example, if they're unable to care for themselves because of an alcoholic or drug-related issue. So moving on to policies and procedures, we have policies that govern everything from how we do our selection processes for promotion to operational policies like we're discussing today on use of force. The real intent of these are to manage risk and also establish our best practices and provide a framework for organizational discipline. And those really involve the standards of how we operate, ensuring we meet expectations, the compliance with our policies, and accountability. We invest heavily on training. Something to think about with how we approach that is what we call risk versus frequency. So if we have a high risk, low frequency issue or potential, like for example, active shooter, we invest time and effort to train to ensure officers are ready for that high risk, low frequency interaction or encounter that hopefully we never have to utilize, but based on the risk of the potential, we want to be prepared. And then if we have a low risk, high frequency, for example, maybe regular driving of a vehicle, that may not need regular training, but only on occasion updates related to the policies around that. And we do focus on professional standards and training, especially from guidance through our California Peace Officer Standards and Training on ensuring contemporary standards, and also utilizing the disciplinary process either through training or even disciplinary measures up to and including termination in the event that there's a discrepancy in our actions as it applies to our policies and procedures. With use of force and de-escalation, the latest revisions to this policy we did in January of 2020, and this was the result of SB 230 and AB 392. Those were laws that were passed, signed by the governor last September, which revamped the use of force laws in the state of California, really a state of the art of contemporary practices as a model for the United States. It was a several-year effort involving a number of stakeholders, and that law took effect in January 2020. And we're expecting additional recommendations from POST along the lines of de-escalation. However, in the light of recent events, and in addition to our really model of collaboration and reaching out and talking with community members and hearing from the community and command staff, talking with people interested in our policy, we made the decision to make a modification this month to better reflect the de-escalation components, both from a reform discussion at the national campaigns that are involved in this, such as the 8 Can't Wait or Campaign Zero, as well as from recommendations that the Attorney General of the state had put out on June 15th. So with respect to those, one of the recommendations was a ban on chokeholds and carotid restraints. While we had already banned chokeholds, carotid restraints were allowed, but we rescinded that as a acceptable defense or use of force. And so our policy currently reflects the standard of no chokeholds or carotid restraints, and that's reflected both in the Attorney General and the national campaigns models. With respect to de-escalation, we had in a number of policies refer to de-escalation. It's certainly inbred in our training and our protocols and practices, but we also took the initiative with this modification to emphasize de-escalation as a component of consideration and formalize it within the practices of our policies on use of force. So that's consistent with both the national campaigns as well as the Attorney General's office. Require a warning before shooting. We do also have that as a requirement. We initially had it as a part of what was called the fleeing felon rule. If someone's running but poses a threat, the requirement for when feasible, providing a warning was specific to that. We broke that out to make it general for any potential use of deadly force. And just a word on where feasible and questions that may come up upon that. So, if we have an individual, as an example, we had a case a few years ago in which someone was armed with a gun, had it down to their side and was not pointing it at the officers. That's a situation in which feasibility is obviously much more expected and reasonable than if someone's actually pointing the firearm at the police officer. And a fraction of a second can make the difference between life and death for the officer. So there needs to be a consideration based on both state law and our recommendation in considering feasibility and circumstances in which a warning may or may not be appropriate. Warnings for less lethal force is recommended through the Attorney General. This is not specifically mentioned in the national campaigns. We do have in various policies, such as with tasers and other less lethal devices, in which warnings will be given, with a general statement in which when less lethal force is to be applied, that when reasonable, it's provided and given to an individual as well. Exhausting all other means before shooting. This area is in our policy as codified by law, and the verbiage very similar to what you see here on screen, which is consistent with the Attorney General's recommendation as well. We feel by spirit and even letter that our officers are required to consider alternatives prior to using deadly force. Intervention is also consistent with the Attorney General and the national campaigns. This was existing in our policy, in which we have a duty to intercede and to report any unnecessary use or excessive use of force. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. The national campaigns have conflicting approaches to this. In some cases, they want or recommend an outright ban. In some cases, they've adopted model policies that are reflected by some other agencies that allow officers to engage in the event an occupant in the vehicle is using deadly force from the vehicle. The Attorney General's recommendation is consistent with allowing officers to be able to engage the occupants of the vehicle in the event deadly force is the vehicle or firearm is being used against a member of the public or the officer, which is consistent with our policy as well. Deadly force is only authorized when there's imminent death, threat of death or serious bodily injury. And we feel it's important to retain this flexibility. If you recall, even these last protests in San Jose, a vehicle was heading towards protesters, or the incident last March in Sunnyvale, in which a hate crime occurred with the person who was driving a vehicle at a group of people. If officers are on the scene of a similar incident, if they're not able to engage, the potential for death or serious injury cannot be prevented. So we feel that's why the distinction of allowing that is important in this case. Requiring a use of force continuum, the Attorney General has addressed this in what he calls proportionality. The use of force continuum is a mechanism by which we used to have a continuum of force, and really it was abolished based on the concern that a force option could only escalate and go up. So we have a number of parameters in which officers must consider various conditions in which appropriate force is used. So we have not adopted the continuum per se. And in discussions, we had thought about potentially a matrix, which is what the AG, the Attorney General, has talked about in proportionality. But I feel that post with their imminent release of guidelines around use of force and de-escalation, which they anticipate in August, will likely have some models that we would consider. So rather than making multiple changes and have that not be consistent with what the state guidelines are, I think it's a prudent approach to evaluate those when those become available. Comprehensive reporting, and we do, as a part of our reporting requirements, any use of force or threat of force gets documented in our police reports. We do an annual report of reportable use of force, which is categorized by the various force options that are used, and report on that to the public through our annual reporting. We also comply with the state's requirements to report any use of force that results in death or serious bodily injury. Last year, as you'll see at the end of the presentation, we only had force that resulted in either no or minor injuries, so we did not have a reporting to the state. Proportionality is what the Attorney General's discussion is regarding using that force proportional to the resistance. That's more of the continuum from the national campaigns. And we do have a significant list of considerations, everything from the size of the officer to the size of the suspect, the seriousness of the offense, any weapons that are involved. There's about up to 18, I think, points of consideration that we identify and train on with respect to proportionality. Finally, on canine use, this is not addressed in the national campaigns, but the Attorney General has recommended that agencies deploy what's called a bark and hold versus a biting mechanism when finding a suspect. And this is a training that for many years we've already enacted and are accustomed to. And we train with bark and hold as a fundamental of how the canines are deployed. We do not deploy canines for the mere flight of a suspect, for them to bite the individual, but the canines are trained to bite in the event that the suspect poses a threat and is committing or is believed to be committing or could be committing a serious offense. These are our use of force statistics for 2019, 26 applications of force. Personal weapons, which are fists, elbows, knees, feet, are used 8 times in 2019, 5 of them resulting in no injury, 3 in minor injury. We had 11 instances of what's called uncontrolled takedowns. This is where an individual would be forcibly taken to the ground with the attempt to restrain and handcuff. And those resulted in 5 no injuries and 6 minor injuries. We had 2 baton uses, both with no complaint of pain or visible injury. Excuse me. And then finally, we had CED use, which are tasers, 5 deployments, all resulting in minor injury. And those were the prongs that are placed into the skin as a result of the deployment of the taser. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Chief Moselle. I think that before we have subcommittee questions, what we'll do is open it up for public comment. So would any member of the public on the line like to provide comment on this item? If so, please click the raise hand button in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Okay. And I see that we have more attendees. And so I just want to share what the city manager mentioned at the beginning of our meeting is we'll be doing 90 seconds for public comment. So I'll actually look to Mr. Gaines. Can you keep time, or would you like me to keep time? Maybe I just want the public to know.
Yes, I'll keep time.
Great, perfect. And I believe I might have to rely on staff to help me promote folks whose hands are raised in the queue. And in line, I first see Ellie Green. So Ellie, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Hi, hello council, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, great. I just really wanted to come on today and address the fact that the presentation from the police chief, while very, I guess, heartening, seems fairly false in that what we've heard the community calling for in the past couple of weeks is community-led reform, and not the police doing what they've already been able to do. I also want to emphasize that these minor changes in policy, while they claim to be in accordance with the kind of calls to action that we've been seeing, we also know that they don't seem to be consistent, they don't seem to be executed properly. What the police chief specifically mentioned already having the duty to intervene policy. Something I would like to point out is the phrasing of shall versus should. I think we've all kind of been through grammar. I know all of you most likely graduated high school. And that minor change basically allows an officer to not intervene or not report it if they don't feel that they have to, if they don't feel that that's what's necessary in the situation. And that to me is very concerning. I also really want to mention the point that we're calling for community-led reform. It's great that the police officers have gone back to reflect, but that's not what the community is calling for. The community is calling for a commission through the HRC to revise and review all police policies, not just the ones that are being called for, all of them in their broader capacity. And council, I urge you to listen to your constituents. I urge you to listen to your people and reach out to the HRC and say, we'd like to run a commission working with citizens to actually address this issue, to address every part of this issue, instead of what we're already doing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue, I see Danielle Parrish.
Hi, my name is Danielle Parrish. I'm a resident of Mountain View since 2003, and I'm also a pastor at a church here locally. My question is for Chief Basel. Does the MVPD provide implicit bias training for the officers, and how often is that training provided? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. I think, let's see. Next I see Brian Eaton, or Chief, can you answer that question now?
Yeah, if it's appropriate, I'm happy to.
Okay.
So yes, we have implicit bias training. The legal requirement, once every 5 years, we have trained the trainers, and it's part of our basic training as well as field training program as well.
Great, thank you. All right, I think we're ready to move to the next speaker in the queue. I see Brian Eaton.
Hi,
Please
everyone.
feel free to unmute yourself. Oh,
Yep.
Go
Can
ahead.
you hear me? Great. Thanks everyone for dedicating your time to this. My name is Brian. I've lived in Mountain View for 13 years. I've never been really deeply involved in city politics, a little bit with the school board is all. This seems like a really important topic. I'm grateful that MVCPRA has helped get me and other folks involved. That said, I'm here today mostly to listen and learn, so thank you for the presentation. I know we don't know exactly what changes we should be making. And I really appreciate that everybody from the city has emphasized, like, hey, this isn't a one and done, this is a long-term process. And so we're going to keep making changes, and I appreciate that. I do think we should be moving towards less policing, particularly for young people and vulnerable populations. It just seems like community care is a much better approach. In terms of process, I do think it's important that the Human Rights Commission lead this work. I'm sure you've all seen what happened in Oakland last week. They were facing calls to defund the police. Their city council ended up rushing through a budget to avoid that outcome. Even folks who didn't agree with the call to defund the police thought it was a really bad look for the council. And so I think because this involves policing, transparency is really important, and a community-led process is really important. So I'm hoping you all will endorse that approach. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, and next in the queue, I see Rahim Ghosh. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, members of the subcommittee. I'm really happy that we are actually talking about this, but I think it has to be said that with what the subcommittee has been doing, kind of it was laid out as what it's doing, and the actions the police department has taken so far have clearly not been enough, and the reforms as proposed by as discussed by Chief Bozell are also not enough. I mean, we even with our implicit bias training in Mountain View, there are more racial bias in arrests and deadly and use of force in general in Mountain View than 68% of other police departments. That means Mountain View as a police department is worse than 68% of other departments in terms of racial bias. And this has been an issue that this is not the first time we're talking about, and that the police department has had a lot of time to solve on its own. So I'm concerned that allowing this process to stay with the police department and with this subcommittee avoids making actual changes, meaningful changes, which is something that we can actually do if we outsource this entire process to the residents of Mountain View, to the community. So that is why we're calling for a independent citizen-led commission run through the Human Relations Commission of the City of Mountain View to fully rethink how policing is done in Mountain View. Thank you.
Sorry, I think your time is up. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Gaines, for keeping time. This is a little bit different with the subcommittee. Unfortunately, we don't have it on the screen, but I saw his waving hands. All right, so the next person in the queue I see is Sarafina Smith. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name's Sarafina. I am born and raised in Mountain View, and I graduated from Mountain View High in 2016. I really want to thank you for starting the subcommittee, and I'm glad that you're already looking at policies from 8 Can't Wait. But I think that we need to discuss the broader question of which 911 calls really need an armed officer responding. Non-emergency calls such as mental health, wellness checks, and homelessness can be served by other city resources trained for these specific purposes. And so I think that an independent citizen committee or another committee should identify what roles can best meet the needs of each type of non-emergency or mental health call and find a way to provide those through social workers, trained city workers, or local community organizations. I'd also like to request as a partially separate note that police officers be removed from our public schools. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue, I see Moira Wong, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your time today. And I want to say thank you all for starting this subcommittee. My first point is just that when we say race, equity, inclusion, I think that it should mean not only improving our police for Black and Brown communities, but also making sure that they have affordable housing so they are not priced out of Mountain View. I appreciate all this conversation around policing, but for this subcommittee to really do what its title implies, I think we need to also consider what it means to have affordable housing within Mountain View. And so in order to address that, I think some of the things that we can look at is resolving the exclusionary zoning that Mountain View currently has. Single family zoning currently only serves to make Mountain View more exclusionary and is directly pushing people out of Mountain View. There's no point in trying to improve our policing if we're not able to allow for diversity, equity, inclusion among those who live within Mountain View. And my second point that I'd like to make is a more immediate and short-term goal should be to create a commission through HRC, because although our police department says that they're already doing a great job, there's still more work to be done. And I hope that we can all remain humble during these times to constantly better ourselves instead of just patting ourselves on the back. My third point is that I think it'd be important for us to look into pledging to have any functions that could be better served by Trans City staff or community partners to be transferred out of the police department. So for example, this would include having trained staff respond to mental health calls or non-emergency calls, domestic violence calls, or calls related to homelessness. I think
Great.
that—
Thank you, Moira. I'm sorry
Okay.
that your time is up. Thank you. All right. Next in the queue is Dana Peedy. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Dana Peedy, and I'm a Mountain View resident and member of MVCPRA. I moved to the Bay Area in 2014 to get my master's in teaching credential, and I've been living and teaching here ever since. The same year I moved here to the Bay Area was when a 12-year-old boy named Tamir Rice was murdered by police officers for carrying a toy gun at a park. And our nation saw the video footage. And I remember thinking at that time, at least there's video evidence, and maybe that video evidence will have to make a difference. 6 years later, I can no longer count the number of murders by police that I've seen on video. And while I'm thankful that Mountain View has not yet been the location of a murder like this, we have to recognize that the systems here in Mountain View are the exact same systems that permit this violence elsewhere. If the rules are revealing violence and trauma across our country, and we play by those same rules here, we need to change those rules. Furthermore, toxic policing in our country is upheld by a culture of internal review in which police are accountable only to themselves, and we need a deep dive in order to deeply understand this with accountability in the hands of the community. So I do want to say thank you, Subcommittee, for your demonstrated interest in exploring many aspects of racism in our community, like affordable housing and bias and things like that, and I'm excited to learn those with you. But I want to be clear that policing specifically deserves its own careful attention from an independent commission free from the influence of the police union. As MVCPRA, we support you broadly investigating racism in the country, and we call on you to authorize the HRC to lead an independent commission to study policing more specifically. I'd like to close with the following quote from Mickey Desrousseau, which says that evil doesn't triumph when good does nothing. Evil triumphs when good doesn't do enough. When it tricks people into thinking that the little good they've done is enough to turn back the tide, and things like statements for peace that point fingers anywhere but inward. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue is Ana Maria Morales. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I just wanted to say thank you very much to council and staff and Chief Basel for setting this up in a timely manner. This is really important stuff we're talking about. While I know that we are still in the process of discovering what needs to be done and trying to figure out the best way to do those things, I really hope that there continues to be transparency. And I'd really like to ask Chief Basel if he's been watching kind of what Kamala Harris and Cory Booker have done with their anti-lynching bill, and if he's, like on top of that and reading about that and kind of thinking about the things that they've proposed, and if it's something that he can, even though the bill has not officially passed, if he can start trying to make those things available to us now, and what he's going to do, because I know that police unions are incredibly strong, if that is something else that you are considering. I'd love to hear about your thoughts on police unions and what kind of accountability an officer would have in terms of if they do break the law, if they do something that they should not be doing, what sort of justice will prevail. That's one of my main questions. Thank you so much for doing this, guys. Let's please keep this going. And we're not going away. This is something we care deeply about. This is the time for change. So we're going to keep, wanting to see what's going on, and we want that transparency and honesty from everyone involved. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you. And before we move on to the next speaker, I do want to give the opportunity to turn to staff if they would like to respond to Ana Maria's question, or perhaps we can get back to her. I look to look to staff on that one.
Yeah, the union question could be pretty lengthy because it's very different, I think, here in the Bay Area and California. In terms of the lynching, yes, I have seen those proposals. I'm apolitical by nature, but clearly support anti-hate crime movement. We had a discussion yesterday with a number of stakeholders around nooses and whether that should be outlawed as a hate symbol, as mentioned by Reverend Moore from the NAACP. So I think all those are very valid discussions in this point, really a opportunity, and I fully support those dialogue.
Great, thank you, Chief. All right, and I believe next in the queue, looking to our Assistant City Manager. Okay, I believe it's Joan Rudovsky. Please feel free to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello, I'm Joan Brodowski. I'm interested in this topic. I'm white, I'm old, I'm upper middle class, and my opinion of the Mountain View Police has been always really positive, especially since I came from a city where the police was really quite deteriorated in terms of services they gave and even protecting the public from things like robbery and murders. So when I listened the other night to the city council and heard people complaining about the police, my antenna went up. And the people who were complaining, many of them had experiences because, or maybe just adjoining the fact that they were people of color, even lightly of color. So I think we have to take a look at what's going on and look at individual incidences and perhaps maybe find the few people who are taking advantage of their position of power. I think this is what would be most important to me. That's all I have to say.
Great, thank you, Joan. All right, next in the queue, I see Kelsey Joseph. Please feel free to unmute yourself. And I believe Mr. Gaines now has a timer. Hopefully you can see all of our squares, and he's trying to hold that up for you in case you can see us live. Thank you.
Hi, so at the beginning of this meeting, you mentioned the desire to take as long as necessary to do this right, which was encouraging because this is a gnarly issue and it'll take some time. But then Chief Bozell mentioned all the things that have already been done, and the implications seem to be that we've already done so much that we don't need to do more. I hope that wasn't the intention, as there's certainly more to be done, and I'm eager to see what a citizen-led initiative would bring forward. As a white woman, the main problems I've had with the police in my life have been that my complaints weren't taken seriously, like when my bike was stolen and police did nothing. So I started looking into this more after that and discovered that as far as things go with the police, even in places like Mountain View, this is basically the best case scenario for many, many people. And it's therefore really important to me that the improvements be led by the people who are most impacted by policing and not evaluated by the police themselves, and not evaluated by those of us with the privilege to have like either positive or kind of milquetoast relationships with the police. No one's fully capable of reflecting on their own behavior and policies, and I don't hold this natural human failing against the police, which is why I think we need to have a citizen-led initiative as separate from the processes that are currently being engaged in. And it sounds like the chief is open to working with the community, and I hope all of this happens. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next in the queue, I see Cleve Frick. Cleve, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
Chief, I just have a quick question about the non-sworn, not unarmed police officers, community officers, and I wondered if there's any interest in maybe putting more of those folks on the street to serve the community in a various number of ways. And secondly, I would also like to make the comment that my family has had a long history in working in community police community relations groups. And I think that the public, and I'm a Black man speaking here, it's important that the public know that police officers don't just serve a negative enforcement view or position in communities of color and culture. They also can serve as positive reinforcements to children of color and children who are under-resourced. And I think it's important that everybody remember that when you think about school resource officers and officers being on the street in the community. It's not just negative. They do a lot of great work. Police athletically being one of them. So I just wanted to make that clear to everyone. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue, I see Ida Rose Sylvester. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
I'm going to need to promote the speaker to panelist, as I'm getting a message that her version of Zoom does not allow me to promote her or to permit her to speak any other way. So Ida Rose, I'm going to promote you to panelist that you may comment. And I did just do that, but I'm not, let's see if that will work. I'm seeing a message that you will be joining as a panelist, but I'm not seeing you show up. I don't know, Chris, with your experience in the host role, if you know something that I can do that I'm not already doing.
No, I'm seeing the same thing. And might give her a second or two to see if she pops up.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe we'll give Ida Rose a second to see if she comes into the box, and then I'll move on to the next speaker and we'll keep an eye out. Is that possible? Okay. So Eva Tang, I see you. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Sound check, do you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So my name's Eva Tang. I'm representing MV CPRA. I grew up in the Bay Area and I'm very proud to be here as an educator for underserved communities. I'm really glad that we have this space to discuss race, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for creating this space today. I also want to point out that systemic racism exists in the structures that we've established. And as Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I'm very surprised that in a community with 2% Black people making up the population and them making up 11% of arrests, as well as a Latinx population of 19%, and making up a staggering 48% of arrests, that we have not actually directly discussed race in the presentation tonight. So I look forward to seeing this through and see the actions taken by the subcommittee. I think community-led reform would put more trust in our police department and our Mountain View government. So I am asking you once again to use the HRC for what they were hired for and authorize them to lead the conversation about policing and public safety. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, I see Ida Rose here. So Ida Rose, if you want to try to unmute yourself and you can give your public comment.
Apologies. I am now
Perfect.
here, and I apologize for that. But again, thank you very much for doing this important work today. Thank you to the council members, to staff, and to Chief Bozell for speaking up. And thank you to the public for so much interest in this really important topic. I'm Ida Rose Sylvester, Chair of the Human Relations Commission, or HRC. We are deeply committed to issues of race, equity, and inclusion. At our last meeting, the HRC created a work plan item specifically focused on supporting MVPD and the community. We believe our experience listening to and convening our community and conducting research that supports public policy will be very useful to the subcommittee. Based on the discussion we had that night, including the one we had with MVPD, and hearing public input, we agreed that a listening forum where members of the community and the MVPD could start a dialogue focused not so much on policy ideas, but focused on a supportive storytelling atmosphere where both the community and the police could tell stories about their experiences with each other. We have held countless forums like this over years. More broadly, we saw this work as a foundation for a larger input process over a longer term with the goal of supporting this subcommittee. Ideas we had bounced around, including working with stakeholders, community stakeholders like the CSA, various community groups, and others. Conducting surveys, having one-on-one or focus group style dialogues with community members, and other ideas. We have a very long track record of this type of research as seen in our LGBTQ and immigrants needs and assets work. I see the HRC serving as a convener, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great, thank you, Ida Rose. Your time was up, but you were on a roll. So thank you for your public comment. And if you don't mind just muting yourself, and we'll move on to the next individual. Perfect, thank you. All right, next in the queue, I see Francisco Ochoa. Please feel free to unmute yourself, Francisco.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Greetings to all. My name is Francisco Ochoa. In the interest of time, I'm going to start off with a couple of questions I have for Chief Basel. Chief, when was the last time the shot was fired by Mountain View? And what was the reason, the outcome, and is that information available for citizens to view? Also, for mental health calls, when someone gets transported by the PD, are handcuffs assessed as being necessary, or is that SOP? Handcuffs lend an element to criminality. Elements of criminality to mental illness is why I ask. The other thing is, can we look at replacing police at schools with mental health counselors? It seems it would be more effective. In any event, my name is Francisco Ochoa. I'm a 38-year Mountain View resident. I'm a veteran, Mexican ethnicity, member of the Community Emergency Response Team, CERT, and I have participated in the past 3 presidential elections as a volunteer for the DNC. I'm a small business owner here in Mountain View, and yes, I have been the subject of excessive force by MVPD, so this is a matter very close to my heart, as it has at times caused much stress in my life. I'm encouraged by the attention the city and subcommittee is giving to this issue. I am optimistic that Mountain View will move forward in a very progressive manner and hope they will work with the HRC. While I would not like to live in a community without police force, it would be good to have police who are truly interested in serving the public in a manner which befits the scope of their jobs. No agency can objectively police their own. Every job has some sort of accountability. And I realize it's very difficult for police to know.
Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you for your time and your work.
Yes, and I'll turn it to Chief Bozell or staff if they're able to answer the questions Francisco mentioned, or if we need to get back to him.
I'll get back to him. The last time lethal force was used or a shot was fired was in a lethal force situation. I think it's been 20 years. In terms of handcuffs, there are reasons for the standard operating procedure around that. I can provide some examples, and I'll have to get back to him on his third question, which is a complex one as it relates to mental health services in schools and city services.
Okay. Thank you. And just I think for folks who are giving public comment to know, we're taking notes on all the questions that are being asked so that we can follow up on those questions that we're not able to answer in real time. All right, I'd like to continue with public comment. And I see Anand Hatiangadi. If you want to unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Anand Hatiangadi. I've been a Mountain View resident for 18 years. Appreciate the statements about the use of force and the changes that have been made around the use of force. One of the things I read about Camden, which has been in the news recently for effectively changing their department, was that they put in place really clear rules around what happens when a police officer does something that contravenes the rules around the use of force. I noticed that our use of force guidelines are somewhat vague on the topic. So I was hoping that you could clarify what happens when someone doesn't, and has this actually happened? Has a police officer been found to have contravened the use of force rules? Because if that never happens, it might be an indication that there's a loophole, and then the use of force rules are less meaningful. That's it.
Thank you. Did staff want to answer that question, or we can get back to?
I think we're trying to retain to a timeline, but I can say, yes, we've had situations in which we've deemed force not reasonable.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue, I see Henry. Henry, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear? Okay, cool.
Yes,
Hello.
we hear you.
I'm a high school student and I've lived in Mountain View for nearly my entire life. I appreciate the steps MVPD has taken to reform, and I'm not interested in attacking the character of our officers or Chief Basel. I'm sure you love the city as much as I do, but Mountain View should strive to be the best. Policing oversight should not be led by the police or by the city council for that matter. That is a recipe for disaster somewhere down the line. We all have the best intentions, so it's about choosing the system that best keeps us safe and best makes policing fair. I know, we're all scared. It's a scary time to be living in. But for many households, particularly households of color, including mine, parents teach the kids to do what every police officer says out of fear of a life-threatening outcome. So action is needed, and broad action. As many members of the Coalition for Policing Reform and Accountability have already suggested, let's get this right. Let's have the Human Relations Commission take the lead, and most crucially, incorporate the voices of citizens who have been most affected by policing. We know that we're trying our best, but it's not about personally what the police is doing. It's about the system that we choose to make Mountain View safe for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue, I see Megan Fraley. Megan, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
This is Megan Fraley. I'm a Mountain View resident, clinical psychologist. I wanted to first say congratulations to Max Bozell for his retirement. I genuinely mean that. This is quite a time to be retiring, and Berkeley and Mountain View are known throughout the Bay Area for having two of the most model police departments, and I want to really honor that and say, as much as I am an activist, I just want I want to be clear that even as someone who is standing for police reform, I am very much recognized that Mountain View actually has been a model. And so congratulations, genuinely, and I hope that you get to celebrate. I am concerned about the process. In terms of this subcommittee, I would just like to understand more how what is worked on becomes determined. Thank you, Melvin. And I think research, like a questionnaire or a survey around what are the main issues in terms of race that the community wants to be addressed would be a better strategy than picking a few things ahead of time. I certainly support the coalition's call for the separate commission, but I think the biggest issue structurally in terms of racism in our city is housing policy and the huge, massive displacement we've seen of the Latinx population. So I hope that looking at rent control and displacement is part of this subcommittee. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue is Anna Z. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Anna Zeiger. I was born in and have lived in Mountain View since 2004. One reason I care about examining public safety in Mountain View is that I believe in the power of community. I would like to share the words from a couple of posters created by Luna Sinite that helped me think more deeply about public safety. Some folks are sleeping on benches in the park. Imagine a city employee comes by and checks in to see if they need a place to sleep, food, water, or healthcare. An hour later, those who want a different place to sleep have one. Isn't that public safety? Someone is behaving erratically and in harm's way. Imagine texting a number and an unarmed urgent responder trained in behavioral and mental health comes within 5 minutes. An hour later, that person is safe and getting the support they need. Isn't that public safety? You are experiencing intimate partner violence. Imagine texting a number and a trauma-informed crisis intervention specialist meets you in a safe place. An hour later, you are working together to make a plan that will help keep you safe long term. Isn't that public safety? You don't realize, but your brake lights aren't working. Imagine a city employee signals for you to pull over and says, "Hey, how about I replace those lights for you right here so no one gets hurt?" An hour later, both lights work and you're home. Isn't that public safety? If you were to ask me how I'm feeling right now, I'd tell you two things: grateful and committed. Let's start with that gratitude. Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Councilmember Ramirez for opening a space to investigate racism broadly across our community. And now the feeling of commitment. I'm here and I'll be here to see this through.
Thank you.
My ask is that you authorize the HRC to lead an independent commission.
Anna, your time is up. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Your time was up. Next in the queue is Yuan Lu. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, good. Well, I have actually 3 questions. One is for Chief Basel. There's a police officer in Mountain View Library. I wonder if there's some data as to what kind of engagement was there that you can share with us. And the next question is really to the mayor and the council members. By the way, I really appreciate this opportunity to actually interact with people to hear your answers. The first is, are you open to a moratorium on qualified immunity? The second question is in regard to city priorities. As I commented previously, in the police department, there are 4 officers in the community outreach and media relations positions: a police media and community relations coordinator, a communications operations supervisor, assistant communications operations supervisor, and police officer community outreach. Outside of police department only.
I'm sorry, your time is up.
Okay.
But if you, I think that was your 3rd question. So if you want to email it to us, and then we can get back to you with our answers, we'll be sure to do that. Next in the queue is Joy Garza. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, hi Council. I just want to thank Mountain View Police Department, Chief Bozell, for your response and transparency. Also the subcommittee, I know addressing these challenging and sensitive topics are hard. I do want to highlight, the police department. They have really championed 21st century policing, and they even did this before the task force in 2014. Kind of helps us to get a historical perspective on what they have done. They've done community-based policing even back in the 90s and the 2000s. School resource officers in the schools in Mountain View, these positions are very highly valued. They're asked by the schools, they're asked by the families, they foster positive relationships with youth and really ultimately deter them from criminal activity, right? So that's the purpose of the PAL programs and after school mentoring and boxing and all the wonderful things that these volunteers do. So I really want to commend the police department for doing that. There's other programs, Coffee with a Cop, there's Cops That Care. These are things that the PD's been doing for years that has really had such a positive impact on so much of the community. And some of these things are left out right now.
Thank you, Joy. Your time's up.
Vice Mayor, if I may. I noticed there's only 20 minutes left in the meeting and the subcommittee hasn't been able to get to the agenda yet. So if I could make a suggestion, I see that there's 4 hands raised, and I would suggest that we give anyone who has joined past Maya. Jill, Nina, Julie, and Maya, 1 minute for public comment, and any hands that are raised after that, I think could be emailed in. I think that we want to make sure that the subcommittee can at least talk and get through the agenda so you can discuss the important subjects and topics that you have on the agenda to talk about tonight. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay. I see that someone just raised their hand. So I think if we do 60 seconds and then we can include Anthony and then that's it, then everybody will stop the public comment there. My colleagues amenable to that. I see some heads nodding. Okay, great. All right, so we're moving public comment to 60 seconds. Jill, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I guess I gotta go fast, huh? Jill Rakestraw, 21-year resident of Mountain View. I've had both positive and negative interactions with the MVPD, and although I still rely on them, it's always with hesitation. What happened to my family must remain confidential, but it caused incredible pain and destruction. Once it was resolved, and I wanted to share my story and file a complaint with the police department, I didn't find an avenue that wasn't outside the police department. I felt like the only place I could go was the place I wanted to complain about. Later, when an SRO put her hand on her gun in front of my child on our school campus, I chose to tell my story on Facebook because I felt that was the only way I was going to be heard. I would like to see an outside police auditor or ombudsman so residents feel comfortable telling their stories.
Thank you, Jill. Next in the queue, I see Nina. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm a resident of Mountain View for the last 2 years and a member of the MVCPRA, and I've had no experiences with the Mountain View Police Department. So my initial thought might be that our police department is fine. I might give them 5 stars if that rating was based on my own non-experience. But this exact line of thinking is what allows systemic issues to persist. So I think that it is so important to elevate other voices affected by police, especially those with negative experiences, and take them seriously, instead of nodding along in a Zoom meeting and treating these incidences as an exception. So I think that this could best be facilitated through a citizen-led committee in conjunction with the HRC to examine the police department and make our city safer for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Julie Solomon, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Solomon. I'm a commissioner on the Mountain View Human Relations Commission, and I'm a member of the new HRC Subcommittee on Police Community Relations. Thank you for holding this meeting. Thank you to the public for your comments. I just want to say very quickly that I look forward to helping to facilitate further dialogue between the public and the police through the HRC, and also on collaborating to collect and share data that can help to support that dialogue and also inform policy change. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Maya, please feel free to unmute yourself.
I'm getting the same message regarding the version of Zoom. I'll try promoting her to the panelists. Perhaps you can move on to Anthony while that gets worked out.
I will do that. Anthony, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
All right, thank you for the time. I just wanted to add that even as part of this committee starts to meet and starts to figure out kind of this process, that we also include just statistics on like who's actually having these interactions with the department. I too I've had positive and negative interactions. I've been profiled several times. And in fact, in a more recent event, I was pulled over on my bike and informed by the officer that I should have let the white woman go in front of me while I was riding my bike. It was ridiculous. I know the rules. I ride my bike all over this town. I've been here for over a decade. And I think it's really important that we start to look at who's actually having these interactions and what kind of outcomes in order to make people feel safe. I don't feel safe most of the time, and that's really it's, you know, it's kind of sad.
Thank you, Anthony. All right, Maya, I think I see you. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
This time?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm glad that the police department is implementing changes based on 8 Can't Wait and the Attorney General's recommendations. But I still think we need to take a bigger look at how a public safety system should work. As a former MVLA student, I'd like to call for all police officers to be removed from schools. I know based on discussions with fellow students, Latinx students in particular, felt like they were viewed with suspicion, and students need to feel safe in their own schools. We need to stop treating young people as threats and see them as vulnerable people. If they're acting out or they're seen as acting out, what they probably need is more support. I'd like school or resource officers in the future to not be law enforcement, but instead social workers and mental health professionals. I think we know that our community really needs that for young people right now. Like police officers may be well-intentioned as resource officers, but the person that students are reaching out to can't be a person who has the power to put them in jail. I also think that we should look at having
Thank you,
more
Maya.
first responders in general be
Sorry, your time
social work and mental
your
health
time is
professionals.
up.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so at this time, I would like to close public comment and bring it back to the subcommittee for discussion. I know that we have a little less than 13 minutes left for our scheduled time. Councilmember Ramirez.
Thank you, Chair Kameh. I'll do my best to be brief. So first, in responding to some of the public comments, I felt that for some members of the public, there's a presumption of a predetermined outcome. And I think it's important for us to assure the public that we didn't come in with a preconceived notion of what a solution is, that this is going to be an iterative process. And I think the presentation from the police chief at the beginning was just a starting point. You know, here are some of the things that we've heard from the public, and here are some of the immediate modifications that have been made, but it's not by any means the end of the discussion. So I hope that is that's helpful for the public to keep in mind. It's the start of a much longer conversation and not the end. And I think it's important also to mention that we haven't yet determined the mission or the scope of work of the subcommittee, and I think that's part of the intention of this meeting. We can help provide some definition, and if it needs to evolve, you know, over time, then that's certainly something that we can discuss. I like the idea of integrating our work with the work plan item in the Human Relations Commission. I thought the Chair Sylvester, provided a good sort of baseline expectation of what the HRC is working on. So that could serve as a very important platform for public participation. And data collection, sort of an opportunity for members of the public to share stories and provide, you know, a more in-depth conversation about, in this case, sort of police policies and practices. So I think that can serve nicely as a complement to other public participation opportunities for input that we've already been doing. Chief Bozell, if you wouldn't mind commenting also on any formal or informal opportunities that have. So, for instance, there was the town hall or the forum recently with I think if I'm not mistaken, the Mandarin speaking community. So I know that this was an issue that was discussed there. That I think also is important for us to be aware of, that there's a continuous outreach occurring, and it's not always something that this subcommittee is participating in, but MVPD has been doing some outreach already informally. And so between the work that we're doing, the work that the HRC is doing, other opportunities for formal and informal participation, I think we'll have a very good grasp of what many different stakeholder groups in the community have to say about this topic. And I think the idea of sort of having the HRC be responsible for a good chunk of the public participation, as Chair Sylvester had mentioned, I think is good. We could focus on a lot of the policy work. Some of the things that I know staff has already mentioned include the alternative service delivery models. I'm very interested in seeing what comes out of that. We can look at what kind of accountability mechanisms are appropriate, things that we can explore in that realm. There's a few other things that have been shared through emails, I think, other public input we've received. Disability inclusion, and that's not just sort of accessibility, but also, if there's, beyond race, there are other challenges. Some folks brought up, mental health, for instance, but if there's somebody with a developmental disability, they may not know how to interact with, with law enforcement, and I think that's something that we need to be mindful of as well. So again, sort of this broader focus on how do we make sure that everyone is safe, and that we have law enforcement that's appropriate and responsive to a given situation. One final thing on this note: there's been a lot of attention paid to the budget, and I think an important component of this work is making sure that we're all on the same page. So I think it would be helpful for there to be some kind of forum or opportunity for there to be a more in-depth breakdown of the budget, of the police budget in particular, just so everybody understands exactly how it works. I feel like not everyone is quite on the same page, and I think that's at least a good baseline, just sort of education on how we make appropriations and an explanation of why we've made the appropriations that we made, and also an opportunity for the public to say, that makes sense, or maybe this one doesn't make sense, and for that to inform our recommendations. Finally, some folks in the community brought up land use and equity in that space. The city manager and I, and maybe other members of the subcommittee, I'm not really sure, we're in a presentation recently about homeownership and sort of the historical redlining practices, the racism systemic racism that prevented communities of color from getting into the ownership market and depriving them of opportunities to build intergenerational wealth. And those kinds of presentations, I think, will be very helpful for us as well. I agree with the members of the public who implored us to go beyond just police practices. That's important. I think that's absolutely something that we intend to address and look into. But there are other forms of inequity that I think we have a great opportunity to address as well. And land use and zoning would be high on my list of priorities. Just finally, I think opportunities to meaningfully engage our non-English speaking communities who may not be able to participate in this kind of format as easily are important. So I appreciate the town hall. Forgive me if that's not quite what it was, but there was an opportunity for the Chinese speaking community, I think, to provide some input and to weigh in on this. And I think that's a good thing to replicate for other communities, and to just make sure that we're out there and soliciting input from all of the communities in the city that I think would benefit from this conversation. So those are remarks, my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ramirez. Mayor Abekoga, I see your hand raised as well.
Thank you. And I want to actually thank Councilmember Ramirez. I was trying to figure out how to organize my thoughts, and I have many, and I know I don't have a whole lot of time, but I think you helped shape that. And I guess I'll just start off with saying that over the last several weeks, I've been attempting to go on a listening tour. So after our town hall meeting, when I had, I had said I was happy to meet with folks, I had a lot of takers, and so a lot of different thoughts. I appreciate folks who have joined us today that I've met with over the last couple of weeks, and they had some great suggestions. And so, yeah, I was trying to organize, some of these ideas, and my hope was, and I don't know if we'll get to it today, was that maybe we can start kind of sorting and exploring some of these concepts and suggestions that have really come from the public. And I think, as Councilman Ramirez mentioned, the areas we can look at are policy areas, and those would probably be more for the subcommittee and internal staff and so forth to look at. Public participation, data collecting, and then the budget issues. And I'll start with the budget issues. I think, we haven't done this in a while, over a decade, but back in the day, as I talk about the day, when we did have a budget deficit with the recession, we did do Budget 101 workshops. And my sense is that in light of what we're going into economically, we probably should be looking at doing those types of outreach efforts again. And so clearly, our budget is very complicated, probably more than other cities as well. And it's probably a good idea for us to go out to the community, especially as if we have to make those tough decisions, it would be important for us to understand what the priorities of the community is. Regarding public participation, and thank you to the HRC members who joined us today, and as well as your conversations at your commission meetings about your taking the lead. And I do think that doing the public engagement would be ideal. I appreciate the listening forum concepts, and I too was thinking about how it would be really helpful, I think, for us to hear from residents their stories, their experience. What is it like for them to live in Mountain View, and folks from all different backgrounds. So that would be one idea of like a panel, perhaps. Other thoughts, I think we need to talk about policing in schools. And I don't know if I know the chief and our superintendent Rudolph has been in conversation, but I hope that we can maybe put something on soon about that issue. Implicit bias, I think, was mentioned, race relations. I know our faith community and Pastor Parrish has joined us. She has shared with me some of their the conversations that they have. And so perhaps we can engage with our faith communities to have those conversations. I would also like to, I appreciate Councilor Ramirez, your comments about redlining and land use. And I serve on the Air Quality Management District, and we talk about environmental issues and how we don't have it as much here in the South Bay, but in other parts of the Bay Area, where the refineries tend to be where the lower income communities of color live. And so it's been very educational for me to understand that historic background as to how this has all come about, and perhaps those would be interesting topics for our community to also engage in. I think when we talk about policies, and so this is, I will get to the police issue, but there are other areas that I would like us to focus on. We have engaged in the youth mental health services topic as a council goal, and we've been working through that with the youth subcommittee, but I think we could perhaps expand that or connect it to these other topics around mental health. Mental health first responders. This is something that I'm learning bits and pieces about. I was on a call, as you know, on Saturdays with the county. The mayors have a phone call, and we started to touch on the topic. My understanding is there actually is a pilot program with San Jose Police Department, a mobile crisis van model. It's a pilot program that's being used, I guess the first responders, mental health, behavioral health providers go out as first responders with the paramedic EMTs, but they had mentioned that the challenge right now is that they're having trouble getting mental health specialists who want to work a 24/7 type of schedule. And so that's the challenge right now. They would like to expand the program to beyond San Jose, but it's a staffing issue right now. So I think these are things that we should explore, but we will need to engage with the county and our other neighboring cities to see what a model could look like. So that's, I think, more policy related. Equity-based budgeting, I know the three of us, and when I created this committee, I was very intentional in the membership. The three of us have signed on to the equity pledge that the county has put out, and so I think we can definitely look at equity-based budgeting, hiring practices and contracting. We've received some emails about that, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'd like to understand better do we have, in light of, and I know ACA 5 is coming back, but are we allowed to have preferences for minority or women-owned businesses at this time? What does that look like? And, how can that change if ACA 5 passes in November? And then, the other area, well, and actually going back to community-based, so I've also been visiting our commissions and our advisory boards, and some of the ideas that came up was like a Black Lives Matter art exhibit, a poetry slam, and so I think that our advisory commissions could take part in those types of activities. But finally, I want to, of course, address the issue of police relations, and I've been thinking about, what we could do, looking at various models. I want to thank, actually, Mr. Frink was on the call. He actually provided me with some information about Police Community Relations Council that is his father started in Florida, in a city in Florida. I'm looking at the bylaws and whatnot, but I think there could be a model where it's this type of relationship with members of the public and our police staff working together and looking at best practices. It would be educational from both ends, I think, getting community input, but also being able to educate the community about what our police practices are. And so I would like to see if we could explore something like this model. I do want to make a comment though, because I know folks have been saying, it should be an HRC appointed commission. And I did check with our city attorney. The city council is the authority, or the one that is vested with the responsibility or the authority to appoint commissions or these types of bodies, advisory count bodies. And so it would have to be a city council appointed position, but I would imagine it being just like, our planning commission or Parks and Recs commission, just like another advisory commission, similar to what we already have. So those are the areas that I just wanted to put out there. And at some point, hopefully we can start to discuss what we would like to pursue. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. And I know we're 3 minutes over time, but I'd just like to touch on some highlights, I guess, for myself. One, I'd just like to thank the mayor and Councilmember Ramirez for nominating me to chair this ad hoc subcommittee. It's of great importance to me, and I take the role very seriously, and really thank the public for all of the comments, both in this meeting, but also via email, and other methods that have been shared with us. It's really important that you are in the discussion. And I think something both the mayor and Councilmember Ramirez spoke of, which is I agree with, of coming into the ad hoc subcommittee without agenda. I think we are all open and wanting to use this ad hoc subcommittee to find what's best for the community and to use it as an open and public forum. I think for me, high level, one of the things I'd like to touch on is kind of the process for the subcommittee going forward. I believe staff had mentioned during the budget last week that the ad hoc subcommittee will continue to meet over the summer and the next couple months with the idea that we'll be able to bring back to the full city council some recommendations and some thoughts for steps forward. And so I think it's really important to talk about that, kind of understanding that process, that it'll be iterative. This is the first step. We're going to be using these couple months to dig into some of the topics that were mentioned throughout this meeting, and then come back to council to have a full and robust discussion. And then I think in terms of scope, both of my colleagues have been talking about kind of the different areas they'd like to dig into. I think for myself, one of the things that stands out is transparency, kind of across the board. So when data is put forward, trying to disaggregate that data. What's the story behind the data, I think is really kind of critical for council to be able to make recommendations. And I think those go hand in hand with how we'll go forward with the budget. I do believe that we need to have more, I think it's outreach, but it's also opportunities for community engagement on the budget. And I agree with the mayor in terms of looking at equity-based budgeting and trying to see more clearly how our dollars are being spent, and then for the different community members, for us to kind of have that readily available. I think many kind of cities throughout the Bay Area kind of have that information that they get from their 311 or in working with the county or through their census. Please fill out your census. And that helps inform these really large policy decisions, as were mentioned in terms of housing policy. I would even say in our transportation, in our bike and infrastructure, right? The mayor talked about air quality. I think that goes hand in hand with transportation. And Mr. Panetta mentioned being stopped for riding his bicycle. If we're trying to encourage people to walk and bike, how do these kind of situations that they might interact with the city deter them from using an alternative mode of transportation? So I kind of want to have that holistic conversation, and in that way reflect on how are we positively affecting our communities of color, and then how are we empowering them, and then perhaps how are we kind of impacting them negatively, and what are the things that we can change as a city organization to uplift and hear from all members of our community and provide them various avenues. So I think those are kind of the general comments that I'd like to make, knowing that we're 7 minutes over time, but really appreciate the opportunity to kick off the discussion. Mayor Abicoca, I see your hand raised. Is that from before? Okay, great. And in terms of next steps, City Manager McCarthy, I know I discussed process a little bit. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of share?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Kamei. Yes, I think so. There's a lot of items that I think we have interest in exploring, not only with the HRC, but just in general, a lot of the ideas and activities that we need to basically just take some time to dig into further. So I think what the best thing to do is for staff to put a work plan together and think through the timing of these items. Some of the things I think, at least working with HRC in terms of the listening or the forums, I think we can think through those over the next few months and possibly have events in the next few months. Some of the items we need to look at over the course of the next fiscal year, and maybe even beyond that, just thinking through how long things might take. So I think the next step is to probably have a meeting of the subcommittee in a couple months, give staff some time to put the work plan together, to do these listening sessions, the forums, working with the HRC, and then we can figure out when we want to bring some recommendations forward to City Council this fall, and which are the policy items that City Council will need to weigh in on. So that would be my suggestion, just to put that work plan together and think through timing, and then just plan on having a meeting in a couple months.
Okay. And I think kind of reflecting that we're into tomorrow, or I think it is, we're into July. So I would assume, you know, I think to at least let the public know that to me sounds like August is what I'm hearing. So, and then something I didn't mention, but I'd like to also see is the possibility to make sure we're doing translation services and utilizing our multilingual outreach to provide both translation in terms of what's going on, but to also have that community engagement piece. Councilmember Ramirez, I saw your hand first.
Thank you, Chair. Really quickly, just one question about opportunities for public input and participation in the interim. Councilmember Matichak, I think, had referenced in a council meeting recently that when there was a lot of community concern about local police involved in immigration enforcement and that kind of thing, that there was an informal opportunity for members of the public who are concerned about this issue to interface with PD and sort of discuss those policies. And it sounded like it was a very productive conversation. And I feel like there might be a very good model in that for this discussion. And I guess just for staff and maybe for Chief Basel in particular, is that something that we can replicate in this case, just so members of the public have an opportunity to interface with you, share concerns, and maybe provide some input while they wait for the next subcommittee meeting?
Thank you. Chief?
Yes, I think this issue is likely a little more complex and in depth, but we can certainly, and I have always held a position of being open to community input. So yes, we can figure out a methodology in which we can have a dialogue on the issues.
Great, thank you.
Great. Mayor Albecoga.
Thank you. Just in regards to the timeline, my hope was that we could at least meet at least once more before we go back to council sessions at the end of August, so that we could have a little bit more conversation and start to shape some of our recommendations to the full council. So if that's possible, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I see both of your hands still raised. Do you still have more questions or? Okay. Great. I echo your sentiments, Mayor Albecoga, hoping to be able to have an opportunity to discuss before our August meeting, and then appreciate your comments, Councilmember Ramirez, in terms of the informal and formal opportunities for conversation. And when you say that, I'm also thinking about having those conversations in multiple languages. And so I just want to make sure that I put that out there, and I'm sure that will happen, but want to make sure I iterate that. And then I didn't get a chance to talk about the HRC, but I do feel like it's a collaboration between all of us to really address race, equity, and inclusion. I think, when the topic of equity comes forward, the word equity can mean many things to many different people. And so I'd really like to take the opportunity to define, at least for myself, what I mean when I say equity. And equity to me is about making sure all, and I mean all, residents are treated equally. And that's not to mix it with equality, but that it's that the opportunities are there. And so just wanted to include that before the end, unless either of you have any more to add. Okay, so we'll move on to item 5, which is the subcommittee staff comments, questions, and subcommittee reports. I think we've kind of tackled a bit of that with regards to the timeline, unless anyone else has anything to add. All right, so I would like to move on to item 6, which is adjournment. And this meeting is adjourned at 5:44 p.m. great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. We'll see you in a bit.